Hello. All right. Morning, everybody. Thank you. Someone said something back. There we go. It's too late, too late. I'm only kidding. All right. Shh. All right. We have this is going to be probably one of the greater, more engaging sessions, I'm going to tell you. One of the gentlemen Jon is on the Next Gen board, and his experience is remarkable, his insight. And so there are so many topics he's going to be able to talk about. So I do want you guys to know that you can open this up to anything policy oriented. And the gentleman he brought is on the cutting edge of what's happening in today's political environment with social causes, which is pretty remarkable. But we always start off by us talking about some current events, civic events that were in the news in the last month. So let's start. What have you guys read about? What have you heard? I know a few are going to come up, but go ahead.
So Michael Cohen testified before Congress, and then it found out that he lied before Congress when he told them about asking Trump for a pardon.
Yeah, so this is going to be really, really interesting when the Mueller report comes out. This is going to be, Jon can probably address this better than I do. I just don't know we're really dealing with something very, very new in regards to laws and what has to happen. I don't know if any of you guys really are, when I say guys, I mean guys and gals. Okay, you guys know it's fellows. Fellows, sorry, it's just my terminology. I don't mean it at all. All right, so if you should really listen to the Daily, it's a 22, hey, you too. The 22-minute, every morning New York Times is a 22-minute podcast, and they actually went in, they interviewed the gentleman who actually developed the guidelines for independent counsel. And it was remarkable, and he actually said it's going to be interesting what changes have to be made from what they originally envisioned an independent counsel to say and do. So what's going to happen with, did he lie, did he not lie? I'm not saying he didn't. You know, a lot of people have lied through this process and how that's going to all do it. But I don't think it's really affecting people's opinions, whether they're pro or anti-Trump. I don't think this is ever going to affect it. I think more we're looking at from have laws been broken, what is going to be done by that. So, what else?
The president met with Kim Jong-un in a summit.
Right. So he met over in Vietnam, which was obviously an interesting choice. Why was Vietnam an interesting choice for them to meet? Go. Interesting. Yeah, it was definitely an interesting place where a battleground. Yeah, it was not. It was. We can question whether it wasn't a pleasant place. So it was interesting, but really nothing came of that as of yet. But nothing's going to happen overnight. But at least there is conversation going. Some people say it's great. Some people say it's bad. What else? Oh, really? Who spoke last session? What was the topic last session? Come on, people, wake up. I know it's raining cold. There's not been any freedom of speech issue that's come up in the last week? Okay. Seriously right now. 2 words. I got on the phone with Will this morning because I was afraid you guys were going to hammer me on this. What happened?
Well, the Democrats are talking about a lot of marketing.
And what did she say?
Because she's tweeting about how she's upset that a lot of people have this double allegiance towards America and towards Israel. And so some people are questioning whether or not it's her right to say that type of stuff and to criticize people aligning themselves with Israel without being anti-Semitic.
Right. All right, so this Democratic first term Muslim elected woman said these things. It's been done before. It's been said by a Republican in another way in the past. And some of these politicians are speaking in a very difficult, challenging way. So I emailed Will this morning because I didn't know what I was going to say to you guys. So this is his email back to me. Yes, I imagine that Representative Omar will certainly be a topic. I won't tell him it really wasn't. Everything she said is protected by the First Amendment. There's no exception for bigoted speech, offensive speech, or anti-Semitic speech without more. By without more, I mean that if someone was saying racist things in the course of engaging in incitement, for example, or issuing a true threat, then the person's speech would not be protected. but racist or offensive speech standing alone is protected. Of course, there's also the question of subjectivity here. While Rep. Omar's speech has drawn condemnation as embodying old and vile anti-Semitic topics, she and her supporters argue that she's merely criticizing the Israeli government and its supporters at home and abroad, an instant of political speech which most requires the First Amendment protection. The bottom line here is that so far the system has worked more or less as intended. Rep. Omar has the freedom to say what she said, and her critics and supporters have the freedom to criticize or support her. Pass a resolution denouncing her speech or taking to the airwaves is in her defense. In other words, the debate we're having now is what the First Amendment is all about. So that was an interesting, and that's important, is that we can have freedom of speech, but the consequences you're not protected by, okay? And so it's going to be spoken in the press, and that's what's happening. What else? Yep.
I know the U.S. wants to place sanctions on Venezuela.
Yeah, so that was interesting what's going on in South America. So the United States about 4, 5, 6 weeks ago came out and recognized a different president than what was elected by, would say, the people of Venezuela. They were quickly followed by Canada and other countries. They are lining the border trying to get supplies in, and the current president is holding firm. But the real understanding here is the issue is that the president, it's really where the military decides to side. The military at the end of the day will control whether he stays in power or he doesn't stay in power. And unfortunately, the people of Venezuela are the victims right now. Anything else? All right. Xanda, you want to come on up? All right.
Thank you. Welcome, fellows. Neither rain nor sleet nor daylight savings time will keep you from being here, and we're so grateful to you. I'm sure it was probably a little bit hard to get up this morning, but think how great it's going to feel tomorrow when it's more light when you go to school and it's less rainy, I believe, having seen the forecast. And speaking of light, we're excited to shed some light on the topics of identity politics, shifting demographics, and implications for politics, policy, and civil society. No small goals this morning. And we're so fortunate that we have two incredible guides who have been on the front lines of so many cutting-edge political issues over the years and who are going to narrate us through some of these. So they're actually going to introduce themselves in their remarks because so much of who they are has informed the work that they've done. But before we do that, I wanted to bring up Daniela, who worked on Speaker Corey Johnson's city council member at the time, Corey Johnson's campaign to become speaker, and had the opportunity to work with one of our keynote speakers today. So she's going to tell you a little bit about her experiences before we begin. Daniela.
I didn't see him that often, but yeah. So I had the pleasure of meeting him a few times while I worked on the campaign, but working on Corey Johnson's speaker campaign in the summer of 2017 was one of the best experiences I've ever had. It definitely showed me a lot about the city, a lot about local politics, and a lot about campaigning. And I think it's a really important experience for anybody who's interested in local politics to have. So if you want to get involved in New York City politics, join a local campaign. You'll definitely learn a lot, and it's an amazing experience.
Thank you, Daniela. That's next generation politics in a nutshell. So I think we're going to start with Jon today, and Jon will tell you some about himself. But I just want to say that I've had the good fortune as a board member of Next Gen Politics. Jon joined our board, I think about a year ago, 6 months ago, 9 months. I'm sure it felt like a year, and has just been such a great addition and such a great thought partner to me in thinking about what we're doing here. And every time I speak to Jon, I'm amazed that anything that's happening that's interesting in our country, Jon is basically working on it. So he is the senior vice president at SKDKnickerbocker, which is a strategic communications and media in the political and public affairs realms. So as we know, communication about what's happening politically is so critical, and he's going to speak with you about that. He's worked with high-profile Democratic candidates, elected officials, and party leaders at local and national level. He's expanded access to quality education and healthcare for low-income families. He's helped pass criminal justice reform and marriage equality in key states. So a couple months ago, when we were talking about criminal justice and the First Steps federal reform bill that passed in December, and people might say, how did that bill pass? You know, there was still Republican control of the House and the Senate. This is a really progressive set of legislation. So if you want to know how that happened, you're going to hear from the guy who helped make that happen. So without further ado, let me introduce Jon, who's going to speak, and then he'll bring on Eric.
At first, I'll knock Santa down. Hi, everyone. It's that weird daylight savings sort of Sunday morning where you feel a little out of it, so I share that with you. I hope to be engaging, etc. Thank you, Santa and Jeff and Lowell for bringing Eric and I on to talk to all of you guys. So I guess I will start out by just telling you a little bit about myself and what I work on and what I do. And since the topic today is sort of identity politics, I thought that I would give a sort of overview on one of the biggest issues I've worked on, and Eric will tell you his part because we've worked together so much on this. And that's the issue of marriage equality, of gay marriage, and Eric and I have worked on that at the state level and at the national level. So I'm going to give you guys that as like a case study. Because there is no more sort of identity-driven issue that has moved from 0 to past 100 in such a short period of time in this country's history. And we've both been lucky to have a sort of, to be able to do work that has really driven it, but also from my point of view, has been able to use communications and use political communications to advance the issue, but also to have that kind of serve as a laboratory for how you communicate to specific identities in order to gather them together and form a coalition and form a winning one. So but just a little bit about me first. So as Santa said, I work at a Democratic strategic communications firm. So my company has its roots back in the early 1960s. Bob Squire, who is the S in SKD, was, he sort of started, created the mold for what's known as now as a political strategist and as specifically as a media strategist. And he started doing that work in the early 1960s. The K is Bill Knapp, who has created most of, or many of the, extraordinarily memorable political advertisements that you have seen over many, many years and many, many presidential campaigns. D is for a very amazing woman named Anita Dunn, who was Barack Obama's first communications director, who sort of worked with him before he was a senator. Going back to that, historic and history-making speech in 2004 at the convention that put him on the map for so many millions of Americans, and but she'd been working with him for a long time before that. Was his first communications director in the White House, so was there for the Affordable Care Act, not to mention, among other very transformative, gestures and bills and legislation in that first term. Knickerbocker was a New York firm started by two alums of Senator Chuck Schumer, so we have very long roots in this world, but we also, I think what we're probably most known for, aside from kind of strict electoral politics, is working with issues and working on advocacy issues and ways to influence the discussion to frequently to pass legislation. So and now is when I guess I will get to the sort of marriage framework. And again, I've said to Sandra, like, if there's something that I'm not getting to, just fire away at me if there's something that I'm not reaching first. I started my political career, politics is a second career for me, working for now presidential candidate Kirsten Gillibrand. Right after she was appointed to the Senate from the House, I was one of her first hires and started as a press assistant. I had kind of gone back to school for political communications and had been so politically obsessed for years that I sort of said, you have to go press restart and just go do this. So I was so lucky to be able to go and work for such a, not just a high profile new member of the Senate, and there are so few senators that if you have a chance to work in that kind of rarefied air, there's just such a big platform. As opposed to in the House, where if you are, in the minority and you're a freshman in the minority, you're kind of fighting over crumbs a bit. And unless you are a breakout star like the aforementioned Congresswoman Omar, who I think certainly we're going to talk more about today, because there's no greater driver of the conversation of identity politics than the disruptive conversation there that has happened over the past several weeks, or AOC, who's three names I don't even need to say because I know every one of you knows who AOC is, being from here in New York, and I'll bet every one of you follows her on Instagram. In fact, whenever I tell somebody that I work in politics who's sort of between the ages of 15 and 30, do you know Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez? And I'm like, I've met her once, but certainly she's such a driving force. But anyway, going to work in the Senate, you can work on issues, but also kind of work with a person who, because they're in this position as one of only 100, and obviously if it's a new senator from an outsized influence in media market like New York, you can design and build something very quickly in just a very fascinating way. So how I got to sort of LGBTQ politics, what was then known as LGBT, there were no extra letters attached onto it at that time. So this would have been 2009. I started in the Senate, as did Kirsten, and it was only. It was LGBT, but it also. And forgive me if I'm coming at this in several different ways, but just to back up, there was the LGBT movement. Was not focused on marriage. In fact, most even gay and lesbian Americans thought that marriage was not on the agenda. No one thought that it was possible. No one thought that it could get done. This was only a decade ago. Not one senator supported it. I think maybe one or two governors supported it. Not one, and a tiny handful. None by legislation, and a tiny handful of states, but by judicial order, had marriage. Vermont and Hawaii, remember, did civil unions first, and that was the biggest deal at the time. Fox News was like, the sky is going to fall and just subsume us all, and most Democrats kind of just kept their distance. Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton in 2008 certainly did not support the right and the freedom to marry. A lot of that started to change, though, in 2009 when Senator Ted Kennedy died, and when I went to first start work in the Senate, a lot of the old giants of the Senate were still alive. So. From the greatest generation who had fought in World War II, et cetera. So Senator Kennedy died. My boss at the time was sort of looking for a big progressive issue to be a leader on. Remember, she was not sort of trusted as a liberal. She had come from a conservative district and had won it as a Democrat. But Kennedy had been the leader on LGBT equality issues, and she said, I will take that, and she became the driving force behind repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which was the sort of Clinton-era policy where gays and lesbians could serve in the military, but legally could not reveal themselves to be gay or lesbian. no matter how hard they'd fought for their country, no matter how great their sacrifice, and it had to be repealed by an act of Congress. And that was still, even though it was a very unpopular measure, and on both sides of the aisle, that was something that was considered a big uphill battle. So Kirsten kind of made me her person on that issue. So I was able to, working with her and the communication shop and the outside groups, et cetera, to say, how do we communicate this to as many different people as possible? And so that involved working with everyone from civil rights groups to veterans groups to groups that, libertarian groups who frowned on the idea of the government spending money to prosecute these cases. So that's part of what I hope we're going to talk about today, which is the idea of communicating one final goal to enough different groups in language that are their priorities, so that you can approach the issue in as popular a way as possible. It's what we just did on criminal justice reform, where the evangelical community would want to talk about redemption and second chances. Civil rights community would want to talk about over policing in communities of color. Small government groups wanted to talk about it as government overreach. So there's lots of different ways to go about it, which we did on First Step Act. Anyway, so it was a huge victory on Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And then the next was marriage, which, again, as I said, was not a prominent issue, but I think Kirsten and others could see that it was quickly coming down the pike, and it was a big ball to move. And Andrew Cuomo had campaigned on the issue, which was considered extremely cutting edge at the time in 2010. That was one of the 3 things he said he was going to get done in his first term. The challenge was passing it through a Republican-held state Senate, so it became, you have to actually switch Republican votes of elected officials. And the issue did not poll all that well at the time, but Cuomo turned to the woman who's now my boss and said, I want to get this done. Can you align like the 5 bipartisan gay groups in the state and, do a media and messaging campaign that will get this done? And the idea was, if you get something done in New York's influence is just so outsized. It's the world's biggest media market. It's the center of the global economy. It is where many social movements are also born. We're a very creative cauldron of a city and a very tuned in group of people. So if something happens here, its influence is just so outsized that it just goes all over the world. And we knew that. But I remember and I did the day-to-day. I left Capitol Hill and went to go join this firm, and I did all of the day-to-day media on gay marriage in New York. And I remember the talking points that I wrote said, 5 states in the District of Columbia allow loving gay and lesbian couples to marry. And just think about that. Only 5 in the District of Columbia. And then when we were able to pass it in New York, the victory talking points that I wrote were, what started as a trickle in New York is now going to be a roar heard around the world. And it really was, in very swift succession, by ballot initiative, by judicial action, by state legislative action, that many more states just over those next few years. And finally, with the 3 cases at the Supreme Court in 2013, the Windsor case, and my firm did a lot of the work around these Supreme Court cases. The Perry case, the Windsor case, and was there a third one? Or am I thinking of Obergefell? That was 2015 now, right? So it was 2 cases, and we were hired by a human rights campaign and a couple of the other groups to do all of the communications around. Basically, it's a whole different strategy when you want to do something at the Supreme Court, because you have to do messaging that shows how overwhelming public approval is for an issue, because you're not really supposed to sort of do an influence campaign targeting the Supreme Court, right? It's supposed to be something that is above media influence. But at the same time, you know that the justices are very conscious of public opinion and are very conscious of not going too far outside the norm. So our campaigns during those 2 cases you know, we were able to have terrific message carriers. Edie Windsor could not have been a more sympathetic and crusading figure, an 80-plus-year-old spunky and dynamic widow from New York who had owed the federal government $300,000 because they didn't recognize her inheritance from her spouse, who was a woman when she passed away, and then two very cool couples from California who just had wonderful families and wonderful stories. So we were able to create so much content around those personae, right? That we were able to sort of captivate the country around their stories. And just in closing, what I'll say is that it's only through a culture of storytelling that you can really get anything done. Most people, when they think of applying the law, it sounds like a foreign concept until you attach a story to it, until you translate it into an everyday experience that someone can say, okay, now I understand it. This is what this has to do with me. This is its effect on someone who I know or someone who I could know. And that's how you sort of mobilize enough hearts and minds and voters to affect change is by telling stories. So that is what I'm in the business of, and this is what just some of the work that I've done in that area. So I think I'll pass the microphone on. Yes. So Eric and I have been dear friends for a long time, but met through politics. When I was Kirsten Gillibrand's operative on, among other things, all things LGBT, he was that for then City Council Speaker Christine Quinn. And Eric gave me the best crash course in New York City and New York State politics ever, and from the ground up, and I would probably know nothing if it were not for Eric. And so we've been doing this together for a very long time and worked on a lot of campaigns, and he's now when I was doing New York State marriage for Gillibrand, he was doing it for Andrew Cuomo. And in fact, people finally said, oh, wait a minute, Cuomo's serious about this marriage thing when he hired Eric. It was considered that big of a gesture that it merited its own Daily News article, as I remember, and I was so jealous of that, but anyway. But Eric is now Chief of Staff to Speaker Johnson, obviously just such a creature of City Hall, and he can speak for himself for the rest.
Thank you, John. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me today. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you, John, for inviting me to be part of this. My name is Eric Bottcher. I'm Chief of Staff to New York City Council Speaker Corey Johnson. How many people know who Corey Johnson is? The Speaker of the New York City Council, and it's so great to see Daniela here. Daniela was on the campaign to make Corey Johnson Speaker. And the speaker is not. Speaker great again? Yes, exactly. Well, the speaker is not. The speaker's not popularly elected. The speaker is elected by his or her colleagues in the city council, and it's the same way that Nancy Pelosi was elected as Speaker of the House of Representatives. But what we did 2 years ago when he was running is we ran it like a citywide campaign, because you've got 51 council members who vote on the first day of the session, and we brought in dozens and dozens of volunteers who canvassed throughout the city for those members. So each of those members was up for re-election or election for the first time, and we dispatched volunteers to bang on doors. And so Daniela was at the headquarters dispatching people out. So when the day came where these members of the city council had to vote for who was going to lead them, Corey could say to them, I worked very hard for you during your campaign, and it's that kind of, and no other candidate worked as hard for you as I did, and I'm going to work just as hard for you if you elect me as your speaker. So that's why he was able to be elected. A little bit about myself. I grew up in a town in the Adirondack Mountains outside of Lake Placid, New York. Have folks heard of Lake Placid? Beautiful town. I grew up my parents had a fly fishing motel and restaurant called the Hungry Trout. My dad works the front desk. My mom is a hostess at the restaurant. And great childhood. But when I was 15, as a questioning gay teen in the early 90s, I attempted suicide a number of times. The last attempt left me hospitalized for a month. But with great support from my family, I made it through. And at college, my first year of college, I wrote a letter to the Board of Education in the Lake Placid School District, telling them of the experience that I had in the school, the bullying, and that the fact that the school had not taken action and that there was no support for me at the school. So they read the letter at an open meeting of the Board of Education, the school board. So I came out to the town, and they then changed the policy of the school and added sexual orientation to the non-discrimination policy, which was a tremendous awakening for me. This was in 1997, of the power of one person to make a difference. So to be standing in the well of the New York State Senate as marriage equality was passed, that is why I say, don't let anybody tell you that dreams can't come true. And that's what I've seen manifested in my own life. And that's why when we talk about things aspirationally, I know they can happen because we've seen it happen with marriage equality. Marriage equality was not on anyone's radar in 1995. It was only on a few people's radar in the late 90s, early 2000s. And in 2009, when Jon and I began working together, no one thought that marriage equality would happen within 3 years. In 2009, when I went to work for then Speaker Council Christine Quinn, the Speaker of the Council at that time, the big news was that Chuck Schumer came out in favor of marriage equality. I mean, that was a big. Chris Quinn and other activists went to dinner with Chuck Schumer, and he came out for marriage equality, and they came back from the dinner, and it was a really big deal. And that 2 years later, it passed in New York State, and 2 years after that, it was the law of the land nationwide. So Jon and I went to work for Andrew Cuomo in 2011, and Jon's firm was hired by the Coalition of Marriage Equality Advocates to lead the campaign statewide. So I, in the governor's office, was working with advocates in Buffalo, Rochester, Long Island, and even the Adirondacks. And I'll tell you, it was cool working with gay and lesbian advocates in the Adirondack Mountains. Who knew they were there? We found them, we had to find them, and they were there, and we were working with them. And during the run-up to the campaign, during the run-up to the vote from January to June, Jon and his team and the advocates were having op-eds placed and letters to the editor and stories in every media market around the state, so state lawmakers, state senators could see in their local paper all this positive coverage of their constituents saying, we need this for me and my family. And the governor was traveling around the state, and one place we went was Lake Placid. We went to he came to Lake Placid to talk about marriage equality, and this was so cool. In the Lake Placid, on Main Street in Lake Placid, across the street from my high school, the governor giving a speech about marriage equality, and me there staffing him and walking across the street after the speech and just deciding to go into my old school and sitting with the principal and talking about the things they were doing. I mean, that's some cool stuff. And that time was such a, you know, I hope all of you have an opportunity to work on something in your careers that you'll get to talk about in old age, and the story you'll tell your grandkids. And these are the stories that we'll tell. And one of the most incredible weeks was that final week when we shared a hotel room, and the vote, it was the last week of session in June. It was 125 degrees, and we all went up to Albany thinking that the vote's going to be tonight or tomorrow or Monday. 5 days later, the vote didn't happen for another 5 days. And I don't know how well you all know Albany, but you can't buy clothing or toiletries in the city of Albany. I don't know why. It's nowhere near the capital. Certainly not if you feel like you're going to be needed in the capital any minute.
If you could meet with a lawmaker, and there was no Uber then to say, like, can you take me to the mall? Right. 10 miles out of town.
Yes. So you have to go to a shopping mall. So we basically were wearing the same clothes for 5 days. Yeah, for 5 days. And at one point, John was washing clothes in the hotel room sink, hoping that we wouldn't get called back at that minute. So the vote, the Capitol was filled with people on both sides of the issue. You had hundreds of proponents of marriage equality from all over the state, and you had many people against it from various religious communities. And they were in very tight quarters in these narrow hallways, and it was these unair-conditioned hallways in this beautiful building. It was gross. Chanting at each other and singing at each other, and very tense at some moments. And behind the scenes, the governor was just masterful, working behind the scenes, and there was horse trading, and there was the Republican conference controlled by Dean Skelos, who's now in prison. Yeah, and the leader of the assembly is also on his way to prison. Anyway, so yeah. So the night of the vote, no one really knew, including those of us in the governor's office, if this was going to fall through or not. They were passing a dozen things at once, like campaign finance reform. I think the property tax cap might have been there, 421A. They called it like the big ugly. They were calling it the big ugly, all these bills in one. And no one knew up until the last second, if marriage equality was going to be in it. So there was a lot of waiting in the Capitol. And 9 o'clock that night, it was the Friday of Pride weekend in June. The Friday of Pride weekend, 9 o'clock that night, they're going in. They're coming to the floor.
And let me just interrupt. Well, every network national cut live to the New York State Capitol. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, like, they all cut live to this.
Right. So we're go to the floor. We're on the floor. The galleries are packed. They gavel in. And there's commotion on the floor. And because there was a deal worked out of who's going to speak and who's not going to speak, during this nationally televised session, and the Democrats insisted on letting more members speak than they had agreed to, and the Republicans are like, this is it, we're not passing marriage equality, it's off, the deal's off, so there's all this commotion on the floor. They work it out. Tom Duane speaks for, Ruben Diaz, senior Pentecostal minister from the Bronx, speaks against it. And a couple brave Republicans speak for it, who, I think there was 4 Republicans voted for it because we needed Republican votes.
And no one wanted to be just, the idea was you will get 0 or you have to get 4, because no one wanted to say, I was in a decisive vote. So there were enough deals worked out.
Yeah.
Created that we got 4.
Can you get into that a little bit? Quick question, I think I'm sure it's
Start firing away.
Yeah, so I think what's interesting is, I love the fact that you said it has to be a story. I agree with that. Everything in life, when you're presenting a paper, I know when people present businesses to me, it's about the story. The question is, it goes from story to has to get negotiated. So we just talked about briefly is on the floor, you need to get 4 Republicans. So can you give a little bit more insight into that aspect of what you're doing? You've got many people, and I'd say not only for that, but like for gun control.
Sure.
The story's there for gun control. The story's there for same-sex marriage. How do you move that to actually getting it to people, getting for Republicans?
Well, interestingly,
What has he promised?
I
And just to add to that, I have some recollection that there were a couple of Republican senators who were already signed up. And like at the last minute, there were 1 or 2 somewhere from Western New York.
Grisanti and Alessi,
Yeah,
yeah.
like had to be convinced. And so maybe if you know
So interestingly, we can both answer this because Eric will know all of the legislative deal making, and I would know the culture of storytelling that we made sure was going on in every one of their cities. So we knew who the swing votes were, right? It was Alessi, Grisanti, Salond, and McDonald. And then there was Andy Lanza, it was considered gettable on Staten Island. So put it this way, when in every one of their markets, we made sure that it was unavoidable that they and their staff, right, could not avoid seeing that there was just a lot of support in their cities. So in Staten Island, Poughkeepsie, Buffalo, Rochester, and Troy, Schenectady, Albany, for those 5 lawmakers. And I guess Betty Little was kind of in there too, although she always kind of plays footsie and then votes the other way. But anyway, and she's his state senator up in the North Country. But anyway, so so in the Staten Island Advance, which is the conservative Staten Island paper.
It's the Advance.
The Advance.
They pronounce it in Staten Island.
It's like Nevada versus Nevada.
Anyone from Staten Island? It's the Advance.
And he's
For
right.
Staten Island.
And I should know that better. Okay, and anyway, we made sure that there was really positive storytelling in the Staten Island Advance so that Andy Lanza had the backup and the cover that he would need to hopefully vote yes. For instance, when I went in there to do like an editorial roundtable, I noticed that the family that came in were the gay sister and her partner and the parents of the former Republican congressman from Staten Island. So we were doing something at the community center out there. So I was able to quickly call the Advance and say, and I'm forgetting the guy's name, but this was like Staten Island Republican royalty. So I was able to leak it to the Advance that they were doing this work, and then that got a big wellspring of coverage. So
The first Republican vote was Alessi from Rochester, and he voted against marriage equality in 2009, the first time it failed. And when we found out getting the first Republican vote was a really big deal, so the governor called all of us in. The governor's very secretive. You probably know that. So us on his staff didn't know which Republican he had gotten first. So he called us all into his office. That's right off of his conference room, right off of his chamber. So it's the LGBT elected. It was Tom Dwayne in the Senate and Jenny O'Donnell in the Assembly. It was a coalition of advocates and a few staff members. And the governor comes in. There's a door that goes right into his private office. He comes in with his hand on the door and says, "The person on the other end of this door deserves our respect, our gratitude. It's not easy being first. It's not easy being out there on your own." And we're like, okay, who is it? Who is it? So, and then Alexi walks through the door, and everyone on their feet, applauding. And he goes around hugging, and people were crying. And he goes over to Tom Dwayne, and he's like, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for 2009. I'm sorry, I was wrong." Da, da, da. So then, from then on, the governor was able to cobble together of the Republicans. But the big thing, at the end of the day, lawmakers want to keep their jobs.
Mhm.
They like being in office. They don't want to lose their office. And if there's a vote that could potentially result in them losing, they don't want to do it. So
There was no horse trading.
there was horse trading.
There was 100% absolutely horse trading.
Okay, that's what we're trying to understand.
Yeah.
Names, you're not going to understand.
Okay, got it.
Get the real stuff.
Yeah, okay. So horse trading could be, and it was in this situation, and it is in any vote gathering and vote tallying situation. You're probably the chief executive or the speaker is talking to local lawmakers saying, "This is what I need from you. What do you need from me in order to get you to yes?" So is that something in your district? Is that a funding priority? Is that something that you want to see pass through a certain committee that you're a part of? So, what are your concerns as an elected official? What are your concerns that I can make happen in order to get you to support the issue that's at hand? So does that help to answer the question?
What were some of the things that they had to give up? Just curious, so they understand is it funding of a project in their community? To switch
I don't know what exactly those things were in this situation, but most probably they were things along those lines. Also, for legislators who are taking a risk, a powerful governor or speaker or majority or minority leader can certainly say, "I'll raise money for you," or "I will endorse you," or something like that in your future election. So there can be the policy cover and the political cover.
And so we switch it over to a different topic, and you look at gun control, which obviously has a story, it affects everyone in
Sure.
the room, and there's a thing on it. We also know the NRA plays a powerful role
Sure.
in money. So
Yes.
So you've got the story, you have the horse trading, but then you have the lobbyists.
Sure. Then you have the lobbyists. Then you have tens of millions of dollars in media and in direct mail and in grassroots organizing. And the NRA, there is no one better than that than the NRA. And gun safety advocates like Everytown or Moms Demand or something like that. The NRA has 40 years on them of not only money but also of grassroots mobilization. But in terms of whenever there's any bill coming up on any issue. And I can see up here there's the political drivers, the economic drivers, and the cultural drivers. That will influence that will influence a movement, but very often what's going to actually influence the lawmaker, the legislator, is how does this affect my reelection? How movable am I on the issue? What are the concerns in my state or in my district? And where will I be historically and also in the moment? What will public perception be like? How much of a risk can I take? All of those factors go into it.
So everyone here, we talked back in November and December about the vote. And for the first time, the youth vote came out. Okay? And when we talked about it, if you recall, we actually put up talked about what campaign message would be run on TV. And nobody was talking about gun control. All right? And then we put up a stat that showed by demographics, age demographics, who was going out to vote. We saw that it was 45, 50 plus were predominantly people going out to vote. All right? So messaging on television, which is the most expensive media, was targeting those people there. That voter group.
But on digital, it was targeting younger voters, and that's where groups like Moms Demand and Everytown did almost all of their advertising on digital during the midterms and did turn young people out on that issue.
So if you were going to empower, I know we want to move on to that. If you were going to empower.
Yeah, help us stay in framework, because we'll just wander.
So the issue, I know Congress will come back to everybody's room as a top issue. So looking at that, what they have to do, going to the three political drivers of, you've got a political driver, you have the economic
We have more,
driver,
too.
there's more than that. But talk to us about laying the groundwork that they can do to get something moved, knowing it's still front page news, but yet very little movement's being done on that.
Sure.
Well, and maybe that's a good segue. So we've talked a little bit about some of the political drivers. We could talk a little bit more about economic drivers around gay marriage. So what you are going to do during the small group breakouts is exactly what Jeffrey's alluding to. You're going to take some of the elements that led to success and doing something that nobody thought could be done as recently as 2009 and getting gay marriage passed. Around climate change, something that's been pretty hard to move, around death penalty, around gun violence prevention, around abortion, and around money in politics.
So all the small stuff.
All the small stuff, the stuff that your elders.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Piece of cake.
Exactly. But this is a great case study in how unprecedented change can happen much more quickly than you might anticipate. So as we continue to use gay marriage as a case study, let's talk a little bit, maybe about some of the economic drivers, cultural drivers. We haven't talked about some of what was happening in television. Many people attribute, like even looking at Ellen, when Ellen came out.
Joe Biden credits Will and Grace.
Will and Grace,
Literally.
exactly. Of just making it, it accessible. These are people you know. Yes, Becky.
I'm just going to speak loudly. As a layperson, I was not in the political arena, but what was very powerful for me was the changing of the message. When I was growing up, it was family values was the reason for why we did not want to recognize gay rights. It was ruining America. By changing the message and making marriage equality about we actually believe in marriage was a critical message change. So when you're thinking about, this was incredibly conservative in a lot of ways, by saying we believe marriage is a critical part to a family. By saying that
Not change it, be included in it.
Included, right.
Yeah.
But make that part of the definition. And by doing that changed the message. And so when you're thinking about the other topics, climate change, whatever topic you end up, think about the messaging. Because if it's not if it's the same, and I'm going to put a negative term on it because this is what happens, the same noise, people just turn off. So when you're thinking about it, think about how you can communicate. Fascinating thing I just read about, and I really wanted, I just read about a man in living in Puerto Rico lost his benefits because he used to live in the United States. He lost his medical benefits when he moved to Puerto Rico. And he is using the marriage equality legal Supreme Court recognition to say that, hey, I'm a person. You are not treating me as a full American citizen when I moved to Puerto Rico. And so these legal drivers can also affect these other topics. He's talking about that Puerto Ricans who live in Puerto Rico should be treated as full American citizens, i.e. get to vote. So these are things that you could think about when you're moving from gay rights to the other identity things that you're talking about.
And that was actually something that advocates thought about, which is how do we craft a legal as well as legislative strategy so that A, we can win and create the most support, but also so that it is so airtight legislate in terms of legislative language, but also legality so that it can pass a court case and survive one, but also so that you can create something so sweeping that, just like what Becky mentioned, it can be applied to many other situations, even if they're outside of what you would think that they would be.
Great. Do you guys want to maybe talk a little bit about key partnerships and citizen mobilization? You've referenced it, but if we want to, get even more explicit about that. And then the other things that we want to get to are, again, you've spoken a little bit about this, but barriers and constraints and how you overcame them. And then just, we can sort of do a little bit of summary about what you think the most vital aspects in mobilization were.
Can I talk about horse trading for a second?
Yeah, let's go back to horse trading.
So horse trading presents, in my view,
Does everybody know what horse trading is? Maybe do you want to define what horse trading means in politics?
Yeah, you do this for me,
No horses are
I'll do
involved.
this for you. It presents to me some real ethical questions, right? We criticize the NRA for bankrolling the campaigns of people who support their agenda, which is basically shutting down any attempts at gun control. Yet, during the marriage equality effort in New York State, there were some conversations with Republicans and supporters of marriage equality pledging support for their reelection campaigns if they were to vote for the bill. So is it right for Mike Bloomberg to say to a Republican, I will write you a big check for your campaign if you vote for marriage equality?
Or I will bankroll $1 million in advertising against you.
Yes, and if you don't, we will come after you. In theory, every vote on every bill should be on the merits of that bill. We should stand around in the room and debate the pluses and minuses of the legislation, and the lawmakers who were elected to represent their constituents would vote on what they thought was the right thing to do. But the reality is that there's a number of other considerations. Money is one of them. It has been suggested that the governor put independent redistricting on hold for the Republicans that session. So the Republicans and the district lines for lawmakers are historically drawn by the lawmakers. So they get to draw their own lines.
Which means that you're choosing your voters aren't choosing.
Right. So that's kind of messed up, right? The big reform push is to make it an independent process. That line should be drawn not by the lawmakers themselves, but in an independent way that makes them good, fair districts that give both parties a chance at winning them. That was in 2011, the year that this all went down. That was supposed to happen. The governor ended up with a compromise, facilitated a compromise that was not fully independent redistricting, and some people have suggested that the Republicans demanded that if they were going to let any of his things go through. Now, that's just an example of how everything's connected. Everything's connected. Now, was that worth it to get marriage equality? A lot of people would say, yeah, absolutely. So horse trading is a big part of all these decisions, and it's a big part of what happens when we talk about gun control. I can see in a situation where gun control becomes a possibility, gun reform becomes a possibility, maybe there will be other people. It could be Mike Bloomberg himself going to Republicans and saying the NRA is gonna, they gave you $1 million last year, I'll give you $2 million. And what are is that right?
Mm-hmm.
But could it get it passed?
Right. do the ends
idea
justify
of
the means?
How do we apply that reasoning where you really wouldn't like it if that was being spent or enacted on something that you didn't support and didn't believe in, but you'll let it pass if it's something that you do support or you do believe in. That sort of selective application of like your own reality creation, I think politically is very interesting.
Well, and to the civics piece, would love to hear a little bit more about citizen mobilization and key partnerships, especially through the lens of identity groups. So, LGBTQIA, well, during this time it sort of shifted to include, more, but how, that could have been a marginalized, just a sort of small percentage of people. Can you talk a little bit about how to bring other identity groups aboard and sort of also how to utilize personal identity?
Or on other issues?
I think we're still using gay marriage as our sort of core case study.
Absolutely. So whenever you want to create a big
Umbrella.
legislative win, or whenever you want to magnify cultural change, what our job is to, in the run-up, demonstrate that so many people are for this, and that this is a popular measure that whatever the lawmaker is getting behind. We're creating a situation where there's less of a risk. The way to do that, one way to do that, is to make sure that as many different identity groups are being brought into the kind of yes coalition. And what that sort of citizen mobilization looks like is you will work with a lot of different groups. So let's say for marriage, will you get most religious, evangelical groups? No, not at all. But what you will be able to do is there are enough, progressive or more forward-thinking on social issues, religious leaders and religious groups. So during marriage, it was a big deal when we got the Union of Reform Rabbis on board, because that can counter all of the opposition that we were getting from the Orthodox rabbis who were showing up en masse at the Capitol. Okay, we then got a counterbalance to that showed that like the faith-based Jewish community there was a difference of opinion, but that there was a lot of support for the issue. Same thing with the Christian faith. So you're not going to get, to Eric's point, Ruben Diaz Sr., who's a Pentecostal minister, and you're not going to get someone from a megachurch on Long Island. But what was our job to demonstrate is you could certainly get Congregationalist, Episcopal, etc., Methodist leaders, which showed that there was indeed a lot of support from the faith community. It was a big deal when we were able to neutralize or either get support from or neutralize negativity from some very influential African American like AME ministers. So A.R. Bernard out in Brooklyn had been a big opponent. There was an effort to say, we know you're not for this, but can you not be actively vocally against it, right? And so that's a big effort when you're working with the religious community. You want to show that there's, you always want to make a business and economic argument for everything. So that's getting the chambers of commerce in all 62 New York counties to try to be in favor, or a business improvement district, or it was so influential when it came to both funders, but also showing that this was a very, very important economic benefit to New York State when it came to creating and retaining business talent, or that this was a tax and economic fairness issue. It was really important to get support from organizations like the Partnership for New York, Association for a Better New York, in addition to the Chambers of Commerce, in addition to, we had a letter from 75 business leaders from Wall Street to Wegmans who came out for the issue, and that gave me something to give to media, and it gave Eric something to give to elected officials in their district to show that there was broad economic support. And you can go through every other category too when it comes from faith to law enforcement to education on down the line, and then into racial and ethnic groups, et cetera, et cetera.
How much were the volunteers who were going out into the community and doing it? How much were grassroots people that you were helping organize, and how much were they employees?
The effort on the ground was largely volunteer mobilized. You had some groups like Human Rights Campaign who had hired paid organizers, but the majority of the postcard collection, phone banks, all that, it was volunteer powered. And the gun control issue is very interesting because arguably the citizen mobilization is something that is missing in many ways from the gun control fight. If you look at the polls for gun control, they're overwhelmingly in favor of, even with conservatives, things like universal background checks. Isn't it over 90% of, it's 89%. I mean, really, really lopsided in favor of gun control. But why is it that the minority of people who oppose gun control have such an outsized voice? And I think the NRA has been very effective at getting these people to make a lot of noise and to be out there in a big way.
And to vote in the Republican Party.
And to vote in large numbers. So when we think about the gun control effort, how do we truly mobilize the 89% of people who favor increased gun control? It's a very interesting question.
And I think what's happened since Parkland is that you have seen, and we saw this to Jeffrey's point, in the midterms, especially among voters 18 to 30, or 35, I can't remember, is that for so long what the NRA has been so brilliant at creating are single issue voters who will vote only on that issue alone, unfettered access to a firearm. What you finally, and have very, very slowly, very late to the game had, is that you now have that there are some single issue voters, especially young voters, who are mobilized almost solely by this issue and will turn out to vote on this issue.
So we're going to be moving towards wrapping up this section. I'm sure you have a ton of questions for Jon and Eric, and you're going to have an opportunity to ask them when we come back after your small group breakouts. But are there any questions right now that are burning in you, especially as they apply to what can we learn, from the case study of the successful passage of gay marriage that is relevant to thinking about other kinds of social change that we want to propel? Yes, Olivia.
You just mentioned single issue voters and single issue politics. What are the pros and cons of that?
Mm-hmm.
A single issue voter is it's kind of a tough thing to wrap your head around. How could someone be a single issue voter, right? How could someone only look at one issue if someone is in favor of gun control, but they don't believe in climate change, So it's an interesting thing. And is anyone really a single issue voter? They say they are. But are they really if there's something else that is really offensive? I've always found single issue voters on the issue of
Abortion is a
abortion
big one.
hard to understand. It's like,
But oh my God,
yeah, you only care about abortion?
or it's not like you only care about it, but it swamps every other vote. Like, yeah, you care about economic development and job creation. Yeah, you care about voting too and think everyone should do it. Yeah, okay, you might or might not believe in climate change or have you, but like the issue of abortion, if that is, and you saw that with so many people who voted for Trump, I think, is that they held their nose on all of the other stuff, but goddammit, he promised those conservative pro-life judges that he brought Mike Pence on. So, okay, I now have a chance to create a system which can roll back what had become the cultural and political sort of norm in the country on the single litmus test of abortion. I don't think it's a positive or a negative. It's not one that's mine. I'm a multi-issue voter, and I think that most people are. What you do see among single-issue voters is an extraordinary level of passion, which leads to turnout, and that is an effective, certainly.
Any other burning questions in understanding gay marriage or in thinking about what you're going to draw upon in your own case studies? And gentlemen, John, Eric, anything that you haven't had a chance to mention that you think will be particularly salient? Or do we want to maybe just do a little bit of review about the key points and how this was achieved? How would we summarize it?
I think that the sort of main takeaways that we've talked about here as a group this morning is the idea of changing laws and changing lives by us and transforming the world we live in through a legislative mechanism by projecting ordinary voices, cultural change, and the idea of what it means to pull together a coalition of many different groups and identities that can give lawmakers more of a reason to vote to support an issue. And I think what we've also seen is everything that goes into the civics or political process, or policy process, I should say, that is kind of apart from civics and policy the way that we're taught to think about it. All of the political, communications, provincial, I guess, concerns that go into this process. That it is the glory and honor, but it is also the messy how the sausage gets made. And that is where policy, politics, civics, mobilization, media kind of all collide, if that makes sense.
I would just say, as you have these conversations, don't forget that this can actually happen. So have hope that this will happen, because marriage equality was just as unlikely as universal gun control was, but it happened within a few years. So the conversations you're having in your groups about how we can get gun control to happen, these are not just academic exercises. This can, and I think will, happen.
And it will be next generation politics, the work that you are doing as citizens and as future professionals. So that is a great segue. Again, we'll have opportunity to come back and be in further dialogue with John and Eric. We're going to break into our driving social change action groups. On your tags, you have the number of the group that you'll be part of. Civic mentors, if you could pick up pizza on your way out. For those of you viewing at home, you can go to tinyurl.com, NGP Social Change, and participate in the activity on your own.